prior to the introduction of the winter heating payment and has not surpassed the projected £24.4 million invested for delivery and winter heating payment in 24-25. Winter heating payment breaks the link with weather dependency and provides financial support no matter the weather, so that low-income households will automatically be paid and do not ironically have to hope for cold weather to be sustained to receive support.
Question 6, Tim Eagle.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on how many houses have been built in rural communities as a direct result of funding from the Rural and Island Housing Fund since the fund was established.
Minister Paul McLennan.
Since the Rural and Islands Housing Fund was first launched in 2016-17, it has supported the delivery of 253 affordable homes. The Rural and Island Housing Fund plays an important role in offering support to community organisations, private landowners and others to deliver affordable homes, and complements the significant delivery in rural and island areas by councils and registered social landlords programme through our mainstream affordable housing supply programme.
Tim Eagle.
Research by Scottish Land and Estates revealed that more than £100 million of funding that was earmarked for rural and island communities was diverted to housing projects in Edinburgh and Aberdeen. Given several rural local authorities, including that of the Housing Minister, have declared housing emergencies, how does this decision square with the SNP government's talk about reversing rural depopulation?
Minister.
This is not correct, as funding through Scotland's main affordable housing supply programme is not ring-fenced for urban or rural areas. There is therefore no money to be returned for analysis purposes. Projects may be recorded as rural or urban based on population and accessibility data and according to definitions set out in published guidance. The share of funding that each local authority area receives through the Affordable Housing Supply Programme is informed by the Strategic Housing Investment Programme and framework agreed with COSLA and supports the delivery of local authority strategic affordable housing priorities.
And supplementary, Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In addition to the direct grants provided by the Rural and Islands Housing Fund, can the Minister lay out what support the Scottish Government is providing to rural and island areas to support community-led and owned housing initiatives, such as the impressive work of the Gatehouse Development Initiative in my South Scotland region?
Minister.
In addition to the £30 million Rural and Islands Housing Fund, which is available for communities, we are providing a 3-year package of financial support of almost £1 million to Community Housing Trust and South of Scotland Community Housing to provide support and expertise to communities to enable the delivery of affordable homes across rural and island communities. We are also continuing to support delivery of affordable homes in rural and island communities through the mainstream affordable housing supply programme, including up to £25 million to support affordable homes for key workers where there is identified need.
Thank you. Question 7, Sanders Gulhani.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will commit to redrafting its disability equality plan in light of the reported criticisms from the organisations that were asked to be involved in its co-production.
Minister Colcap-Stewart.
Thank you. I recently met with Jeremy Balfour and other members and the disabled people's organisations to discuss the plan. It will take a collective effort and investment over several years to deliver equality for disabled people. This first publication is one step on that journey and does not represent the full extent of our ambition. Due to the challenging fiscal situation, difficult decisions had to be made to ensure that this first stage of our plan is deliverable. The plan lays important foundations around improved accountability and collective leadership and can build on future phases to deliver impactful change.
Sanders Gulhani.
Clearly, the Minister was not at the meeting that she remembers, because Disability Equality Scotland, Glasgow Disability Alliance and Inclusion Scotland have described their members as raging with the Scottish Government. They say co-production process has been a sham and they are left with a weak and diluted disability plan. To quote Theresa Burt, GDA's Chief Executive, the plan offers no commitment to meaningful action and no progress towards disabled people's equality. And after spending 20 months of time and resources trying to collaborate with the Scottish Government, co-production has collapsed and DPOs have withdrawn support. This is a very familiar tale when it comes to this SNP government. They say they've engaged, but the problem is they don't actually listen and yet again have failed to deliver on their promises. So will the Minister now make urgent changes to the plan, given not one of the stakeholders' 5 key asks have been met by this version?
Minister.
I would reassure the Parliament and the member that I have extensively engaged with the disabled people's organisations and am in regular contact with them. We have taken the time needed to genuinely engage with disabled people's organisations, fully considering their feedback and make changes wherever possible. We have heard their concerns loud and clear. That is what meaningful cooperation requires, and it reflects my commitment to ensuring this plan can and will be delivered. Collective leadership, accountability and disability competence underpin every action in the plan, taking dedicated cross-governmental work to achieve that.
Thank you. A couple of supplementaries. First, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Minister, I was dismayed to read Keir Starmer's comments on the bulging benefits bill blighting our society. This type of rhetoric perpetuates and stigmatisation of social security support and deters people who need support from seeking it, including disabled people who we know have a high instance of poverty in the family. Many of my colleagues will have just been donning a Christmas jumper with Save the Children, who are looking to reduce this stigma around poverty too. So will they welcome me welcoming the Government's Equality and Human Rights Fund and the work that it will provide for disabled people's organisations in supporting them in Scotland this year?
Minister.
I thank Claire Adamson and I do agree with her comments. Our £5 million Equality and Human Rights Fund is helping to tackle inequality and discrimination. The forecast spend for 24-25 on the disability portfolio included within the fund is £2.1 million. This is inclusive of core grant funding to disabled people's organisations, Glasgow Disability Alliance, Disability Equality Scotland and Inclusion Scotland. The fund also includes a range of projects that deliver vital services to disabled people across Scotland.
And briefly, Willie Rennie.
The disability groups have heard all of that before and they're not impressed. In fact, they were raging at the meeting I was at. In fact, they swore they were so angry with the Minister and the Government's actions. And for SNP MSPs who are groaning away when this question has been raised, they should have been at that meeting because they would have understood how angry these groups are. What the Minister needs to set out is what new is she going to do today to repair that relationship with that sector, because unless she brings something new, they won't believe her ever again.
Minister.
I thank Willie Rennie for raising that. As he pointed out, I was at that meeting and I have already stated that I have heard loud and clear their concerns and their frustrations. But I will continue to engage because that is my duty and my job to do so. I recognise the aspirations of disabled people and their organisations lie beyond what could be delivered in the first phase of the plan. Difficult decisions have had to be made to ensure that the actions can be achieved in a very challenging economic situation that Scotland faces. There is a budget that is coming, so I ask for members across the chamber to be voting for a budget which I am hopeful that will provide some kind of reassurance to the disability people's organisations.
Thank you. In question 8, Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, as part of its work on diversity, inclusion and equalities, what recent discussion the Minister for Equality has had with ministerial colleagues regarding work to tackle Islamophobia?
Minister Cockap-Stewart.
The Scottish Government recognises the importance of tackling Islamophobia while ensuring equality and inclusion for everyone. In September, I wrote to ministers across Government reminding them of their legal duties under the Public Sector Equality Duty. I am now undertaking one-to-one meetings with them and I continue to work closely with those holding shared portfolio interests, including the Minister for Victims and Community Safety, who has responsibility for hate crime. This will explore what actions can be taken to improve equality and human rights and reflect our collective agenda to tackling all forms of religious prejudice, including Islamophobia.
Faisal Chowdhury.
I thank the Minister for the answer. After the events of this summer, it is more important than ever we work to tackle Islamophobia and hate. The Scottish Government accepted the recommendation of the cross-party group on challenging racial and religious hate report on Islamophobia. Can the Minister advise what progress the Scottish Government is making on implementing the report, including an adoption of a definition of Islamophobia and a workplace discrimination toolkit?
Minister.
Our ongoing work on tackling hate crime through work to tackle the causes of Islamophobia is incorporated into key priorities, including delivery of the hate crime strategy, as well as wider cross-governmental activities. Our approach is supported by equality stakeholders, and there are regular opportunities to continually review priorities for tackling all forms of hatred and prejudice, including Islamophobia. The UK Government are also currently considering this issue, and we will consider any decisions made and implications for our own approach to adopting a definition in due course.
Thank you. That concludes portfolio questions. The next item of business is a statement by Shirley Ann Somerville on supporting older people with increasing energy costs. Further to an earlier point of order, some aspects of the Scottish Government statement have appeared in the media and therefore in the public domain before this Parliament's elected members have an opportunity to put questions to the Government. It is the Government's responsibility to manage this information to avoid this occurring, which is disrespectful to the Parliament. The Cabinet Secretary has written to me to apologise, but in the interests of our constituents and of public transparency, I will allow the statement to be made. I have asked the Cabinet Secretary to shorten the statement to allow more time for questions. We will now pass to point of order, Jeremy Balfour.
I'm grateful for your clarification, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, normally spokesmen and spokeswomen get sight of the statement. That has only just happened, I understand, having spoken to my colleagues. That means it will be very difficult to properly scrutinise this statement. And I did wonder, have you thought of asking the Government to move this to perhaps later on today, before decision time, so that this Parliament can properly scrutinise a very important decision that is going to be made?
Thank you, Mr Balfour. It is, of course, convention that the Scottish Government strive to ensure that members have as much pre-sight of any statement as possible. We will continue with this item of business, but your comments are on the record. I will now pass to the Cabinet Secretary, Shirley Ann Somerville.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I move to making my statement, let me apologise to you once again, and indeed to the Chamber, for the unfortunate early coverage of some of the content of my statement in the media this morning. This coverage regretfully gave high-level information regarding the announcement I am about to make. We take very seriously your guidance that details of any major announcement should not be publicly released before it is made to Parliament. Accordingly, as you have said, Presiding Officer, I have written to you to formally apologise, and I am grateful for the opportunity to make a shortened version of the statement now and answer members' questions. And I would also add an apology to opposition spokespeople for the fact that they have not had early sight of my statement, as I usually do. Moving to the statement itself, Presiding Officer. As Parliament will know, the UK Government announced its decision on the 29th of July to restrict entitlement to the winter fuel payment to those in receipt of pension credit and other means-tested benefits from this winter. This meant that an important provision of financial support that had up until now been available to all pensioners across the UK was abolished. This decision was taken with less than an hour's notice to and no discussion with the Scottish Government. As a result of this decision, Scotland's share of the block grant adjustment funding, which we had planned to use to introduce pension age winter heating payment, our like-for-like replacement for winter fuel payment, was cut by £147 million. That, Presiding Officer, is a cut of over 80% of that budget. This had an immediate and profound impact on our ability to continue as planned and to offer our payment as the universal benefit as we had intended this year. As you will be aware, we could not identify the additional funding required in year in order to mitigate the UK Government's decision. Additionally, the timing of the UK Government announcement meant that alternative approaches to either a universal payment or the means-tested approach introduced by the UK Government could not be implemented in the time available to us. We have repeatedly urged the UK Government to reverse this decision, and indeed the Parliament has supported that call. But our representations have been ignored, and payments of this benefit will be delivered by the DWP under an agency agreement with Scottish ministers this winter. This approach will at least ensure vital support is available to eligible pensioners most in need of help for their fuel bills this winter. Presiding Officer, unfortunately this means once again we are in a position where the Scottish Government is having to mitigate the impact of the UK Government's damaging decision on social security policy. There has been change, but that change is that we are now mitigating against a Labour Government and not a Tory one. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government provides a wide range of heating cost to our pensioners. For example, our winter heating payment guarantees a reliable annual payment, and unlike the UK Government's cold weather payment, it does this regardless of the weather or temperature or proximity to a weather station. We are also continuing our child winter heating payment, which last year provided support to over 30,000 children, young people and their families who had higher energy cost needs due to disability or a health condition. This benefit is not available elsewhere in the UK. Meanwhile, our Warmer Homes Scotland and our area-based schemes support people experiencing fuel poverty to make their homes warmer and more fuel efficient. In the last decade, these two programmes have supported over 150,000 households living in or at risk of fuel poverty. All these programmes are valuable, but we are also recognising that households across the country acutely feel twin pressures. Firstly, cuts to social security budgets made over many years by successive UK governments, Conservative and now Labour. And secondly, rising energy costs, and that is despite Labour's promise that people's energy bills would fall if they were in government, and of course they are set to rise once again in January. Presiding Officer, this year alone the Scottish Government has already spent £134 million mitigating the effects of UK Government welfare decisions. Whilst we cannot possibly mitigate every decision made by the UK Government, we are determined to do more where it is possible to do so. I am therefore announcing today that the Government will invest a further £20 million in the Scottish Welfare Fund's budget to be distributed to councils this financial year. Presiding Officer, this increase will help councils meet increased demands upon the fund as a result of the decisions taken by Westminster. I am also confirming today that we will invest an additional £20 million in the Warmer Homes Scotland scheme. This scheme provides focus on long-term sustainable measures, and this additional funding will help a wider group to install energy efficiency measures and more efficient heating systems, saving on average around £300 per year per household in energy bills. Finally, for this year, in response to calls from a coalition of housing and anti-poverty organisations for a shift in spending from crisis intervention to prevention, I will direct an additional £1 million of grant funding to registered social landlords and third sector partners for tenancy sustainment and homelessness prevention work. Presiding Officer, whilst these measures will go some way to allay the fears of older people in Scotland ahead of winter, the Government recognises that more must be done. And this is precisely why I have consistently committed to keeping the eligibility for pension age winter heating under review. After careful consideration, I am announcing today to Parliament that ahead of next winter, I will bring forward regulations to introduce a universal pension age winter heating payment in winter 25-26 for every single Scottish pensioner.
Thank you.
Presiding Officer, this universal benefit, providing much-needed support not available anywhere else in the UK, will deliver support across Scotland's older people, as we had always intended to do before the UK Government's decision to cut the payment. It will help mitigate the increases in energy costs, provide vital cost of living support for all pensioner households and help reduce pensioner poverty. The full details of our proposed approach will be set out in the Scottish Government's budget. However, I can announce that pensioners in Scotland in receipt of relevant qualifying benefits such as pension credit and who will this winter receive payments of £200 or £300 dependent on their age will continue to receive those payments automatically next winter. Additionally, we will introduce universal payments to every other pensioner household of £100. This ensures that those pensioners in receipt of pension credit or other means-tested benefits will receive a higher amount of support, protecting their incomes, while also ensuring the provision of support to all pensioner households, support that will not be available elsewhere in the UK. Presiding Officer, we haven't taken this decision lightly, given the significant pressures on the Scottish Government's budget. But this Scottish Government is determined to stay true to our values. On our watch, we will treat people in this country with fairness, dignity and respect. We will not abandon older people this winter, or indeed any winter, and we will continue to protect our pensioners from the harsh reality of a UK Labour government.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes or so for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business. And I'd be grateful if members who wish to put a question were to press their request to speak buttons. And I call Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I very much note what you said in your first remarks. The Scottish Government was quite rightly angered by the UK Government not giving any notice and therefore undermining the scrutiny that was necessary, yet the same has happened this afternoon when we do not get prior sight in time to scrutinise this properly. And of course, there is more than a hint of irony in this announcement, because the SNP is constantly moaning that their fiscal hands are tied by the bad deeds of Westminster. But as the Scottish Fiscal Commission rightly said a few months ago, some of the real pressure on budgets comes from the Scottish Government's own decisions. So it is simply not true for ministers to argue that they had absolutely no choice but to leave pensioners out in the cold. I have two questions for the Cabinet Secretary. Firstly, would the Cabinet Secretary admit that the SNP are actually hoodwinking pensioners by pretending that they are bringing back the full winter fuel payment, because that is simply not the case? And secondly, in her statement, the Cabinet Secretary mentions that she is bringing forward regulations. Can I ask her to confirm whether that means primary legislation, and if so, when will that happen?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I said at the beginning of my remarks I apologise to the opposition spokespeople, and I would do so directly to Liz Smith as well. I hope she knows me well enough and long enough now that this was absolutely not my intention. Presiding Officer, we have returned to a universal payment for pensioners, and that is an important principle that we are determined to hold to. And I think if anyone is concerned, Presiding Officer, about the principles behind social security, it would be the discussion that Russell Finlay has instigated since taking over leadership of the Scottish Conservatives, when he has questioned the amount that we spend on social security in Scotland. When I questioned him directly on this, about whether that meant he wanted to cut money for low-income families, whether it was for disabled people, carer or pensioners, he couldn't give me an answer. And I think that's the most concerning aspect for people. So we do see this as an investment in our people. We see it as an important protection for our pensioners. And with response to Liz Smith's questions about the regulations, they will be through secondary legislation, as we do for all benefits, as we have done since the original bill in 2018 became an act.
Thank you. I call Paul O'Kane.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It would of course be customary to thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement, although I do note the very short period of time. However, we of course read it in some detail this morning in the press. I would want to begin by welcoming finally the support that is being offered in terms of this winter. I think that's the first place to start, because the Cabinet Secretary knows that I have always said there was more that could be done this winter. I would point to the fact that I have consistently in this chamber raised the issue of the £42 million that will come as a result of UK Government decisions on the Household Support Fund. So the first thing I would ask the Cabinet Secretary to do is confirm, is this her finally giving some clarity to what that money is going to be used for, that Barnet consequential that will come as a result of spending this winter? In addition, Presiding Officer, we have always said that pension age winter heating payment, a devolved payment to Scotland, was an opportunity to widen the criteria above pension credit. I would point again to the in-year announcement of Barnet consequentials for the Scottish Government of £1.5 billion, rising to £3.4 billion in the budget next year. And I would ask the Cabinet Secretary, is it as a result of that spending that she is able to announce that she will bring forward regulations on pension age winter heating payment, which she said previously was impossible because she didn't have the money, and I quote, she couldn't base the budget on a wing and a prayer. And finally, Presiding Officer, will she be speaking to the Poverty and Inequality Commission about their view of her payment?
Cabinet Secretary.
can I gently point out to Paul O'Kane that we wouldn't have to be mitigating this summer if Labour government hadn't whipped away money from pensioners this year. That's why I'm having to come forward to this pension today. So I think, as well as asking some questions, which he is obviously right to do, Mr O'Kane and his party should come here with a bit of humility and a bit of an apology for Scotland's pensioners for putting us in the position in the first place, presiding officer. And Mr O'Kane always said, and forgive me if I'm slightly misquoting him, we've always said. With the greatest respect, Labour have said a lot of things, both at a UK level and a Scottish Government level since the Chancellor made this announcement. But most particularly, there have been 2 votes on this, one in the UK Parliament, one in the Scottish Parliament, and everybody was whipped to vote against Scotland's pensioners. Well, I'm proud that this Scottish Government is once again stepping up to defend Scotland's pensioners. We'll continue to do that. It's a shame Scottish Labour haven't done the same.
I call Claire Adamson to be followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Labour promised to lower energy bills, but instead the energy price cap has risen twice, with the UK Government in total inaction. Labour cut the provision to 900,000 Scottish pensioners. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that mitigating against bad decisions cannot go on indefinitely, and it would be much better if the decisions and the regulation of energy were here in our own independent Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm hearing groans, presiding officer, as we talk about the fact that we continue to come back here to mitigate, both from the Scottish Conservatives and Scottish Labour. And I think that says a lot about where the debate is here at the moment, because I do share the members' frustration that we are once again here to talk about mitigation. As I said in my original remarks, we're already spending £134 million this financial year to mitigate against some of the worst excesses of UK Government policies. The fact that we are having to do so again, presiding officer, is not just deeply disappointing, but it's also a deeply expensive way to try and protect people. And if only this Parliament had the ability to make more decisions like this, but in a way where we weren't shackled to Westminster spending decisions, we could do so much more. But until that day comes, we will continue to do what we can to protect pensioners, those on low incomes, and indeed everyone else that relies on social security, which is an investment in our people.
I call Jeremy Balfour to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, President Officer. Cabinet Secretary, can you confirm that the Household Support Fund block grant adjustment is £41 million? So the Scottish Government will not be spending any more money out of their own pocket this year. And will she also confirm that there will be no more money going into people's pockets directly in this financial year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding officer, we as a government have to look very carefully at how quickly we can provide support to people, and that's particularly important when the UK Government, as I said in my statement, gives no forewarning of decisions like this. So the quickest way that we can do so is to use something like the Scottish Welfare Fund, which has been an established practice that we've done in the past to assist people, for example, during COVID. And that's an important way that we can assist people with an immediate crisis. I mentioned, of course, in my remarks that we are doing more to help in a systemic way as well. But again, with the budget on the way just next week, presiding officer, Jeremy Balfour seems to come questioning that he wants to spend more, at the same time that his front bench wants the government to make tax cuts. I'm afraid that doesn't make economic sense, presiding officer.
Thank you. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you very much, presiding officer. The Cabinet Secretary's statement will come as a relief to pensioners and low-income households in my Inverclyde constituency and also across Scotland who face financial uncertainty this winter as a result of brutal Labour UK Government cuts. Now, that said, does the Cabinet Secretary share my frustration that such significant Scottish Government resources must once again be directed towards mitigating Westminster austerity, measures like the winter fuel payment cut, the benefit cap and the bedroom tax, despite Keir Starmer's promise of change?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, again, I think the member is quite right to point out not just to the mitigation, but the financial cost of that mitigation, because, as Stuart McMillan points out, the work to mitigate against the bedroom tax, to mitigate against the benefit cap, that's a decision that we have taken, and I do believe that that is the right one, as is our decision to mitigate again today. But that money could be spent on a variety of different ways, whether it's on anti-poverty measures or whether it's on education or on the NHS. And again, as we look to the budget next week, the fact that the Scottish Government has to continue to mitigate against the Conservatives and now Labour does require us to make difficult decisions in other portfolios. That is a responsibility we take seriously, and I hope as a minority government that means that the other parties in this chamber also rise to their responsibility and ensure we have a budget passed next week so that we can continue to support people in some difficult times over this winter.
Thank you. I call Colin Smith to be followed by Jackie Dunbar.
Presiding Officer, more than half of older people in Scotland live in homes that have poor levels of energy efficiency with an EPC rating of D or below, at a time that fuel poverty under this government is at a record level amongst those in later life. So why, Cabinet Secretary, is there such low awareness of the government's energy efficiency schemes, as low as 39% amongst older people, according to the Chartered Institute of Buildings, which means far too few older people actually benefit from the energy efficiency schemes that the Cabinet Secretary has talked about today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, 150,000 households in or at risk of fuel poverty have been supported by our energy efficiency schemes in the last decade. But as the member talks about fuel poverty, I hope he would bear in mind that one of the reasons for fuel poverty is energy costs, Presiding Officer. Energy costs that Labour said they would cut, and yet we are seeing further and further increases in the energy costs just at the time as they are taking money away from pensioners. So we do indeed need to make sure that people are aware of the schemes that are available, but I hope he will join with me in the support of the announcements made today to further extend the investment that's going into Warmer Homes Scotland.
I call Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite Labour's pre-election promise to slash bills by £300, household energy prices rose by £149 in October and are set to rise again this January. It's vital that we work to make pricing fairer, and I welcome the Scottish Government's work so far on a social tariff. So can the Cabinet Secretary say any more about how a social tariff may operate and how it will help lower costs?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Jackie Dunbar for that question? She is quite right to point out to the important role that a social tariff could play in assisting those either in fuel poverty or at risk of fuel poverty. She'll be aware of the work that Scottish Government ministers are taking forward on a social tariff and the working group that has been set up and is meeting. I think it's due to meet again in December. Of course, the ability to deliver on that social tariff comes down to the UK Government. And at least, Presiding Officer, if they are continuing to be determined to take money away from pensioners, I hope they will take the work that is being progressed in that working group away, act upon it and actually deliver on that social tariff.
I call Maggie Chapman to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the additional investment in the Scottish Welfare Fund and the Warmer Homes Scotland scheme. But temperatures have already plummeted and people are already being forced beyond the choice between heating their homes and eating. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how her government will ensure that this money will actually get to those who need it this year, right now?
Cabinet Secretary.
Mike Chapman is quite right. We don't need just to deliver on the funding, which we are announcing today, but also to ensure that we are supporting Scotland's councils as they, of course, administer the Scottish Welfare Fund. And that's exactly why, as part of the package of £20 million, we've recognised that we will need to support councils with the administration costs of that. So I give her assurance that that has been taken account of so that we can support our councils, get that money out the door as quickly as possible.
Call Willie Rennie to be followed by Christine Graham.
Liberal Democrats have opposed the cuts to the winter fuel payment, so we do welcome this statement today and the change in direction, because it's a step in the right direction, especially with Scotland's colder climate. Now, opposition members, for the sake of clarity, opposition members are often challenged by government ministers about where the money comes from for particular policies, and that's a fair question to ask. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary where the money came for this policy so that it can be funded properly?
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Rennie is quite right to put that challenge back to me. I've often made it to him in this chamber and elsewhere. As I mentioned as part of my remarks, the budget will be announced next week. The discussions around the support package that is being announced today has been discussed in Cabinet as part of that Scottish Government budget. And if I can ask Mr Rennie to wait just that little bit longer, the announcements on the rest of the Scottish Government budget will of course be made for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance next week.
I call Christine Graham, to be followed by Craig Hoy.
Thank you very much. Again, like many in here, I welcome this announcement.
Here, Ms Graham. Christine Graham.
Terribly rude. I welcome these, unfortunately, more mitigations we're having to make as this government. As I understand it, we have two categories. The pensioners on pension credit will get the 200 to 300, depending if they're single or age and so on. And the other category, the rest of us, and I include myself there, £100. But 40% of those entitled to pension credit don't receive it. No fault of this government, and it's been that for a very, very long time. So they'll, I take it, because DWP has those figures, they'll just receive the 100, which is fine. But how on earth do we get that pension credit uptake increased? Because that really still leaves some pensioners out in the cold.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Christine Graham's quite right to point to the need to encourage uptake of pension credit. She will be aware that this government has a benefit uptake strategy. It's the only benefit uptake strategy in the UK, and we are determined to encourage those that are entitled to benefits to apply for them. Of course, pension credit is a reserved benefit and therefore not part of that benefit uptake strategy. But regardless of us not having the responsibility to do so, we have tried through Social Security Scotland and other public agencies, and I would give thanks to our local authority partners on this as well, try to encourage further uptake of pension credit. Belatedly, the UK Government is delivering on a pension credit uptake strategy. That is welcome, but there is much more that can be done on this, and the responsibility in the main does lie with the UK Government on this issue, although we continue to play our part, as I'm sure Christine Graham would remind me often we should do.
Call Craig Hoy, to be followed by Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I note that the Minister has yet again sought to turn this issue into a constitutional grievance. The SNP would cynically like us to believe
that benefit
Hoy mitigations such as that announced today are only necessary because we remain part of the UK. Yeah. But isn't it the case that the only reason the Scottish Government can offer these benefits is precisely because of the Barnet funding formula that gives her government £2,200 additional money to spend on benefits and services for every man, woman and child in Scotland today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think Mr Hoy may wish to reflect on the constitutional aspects of this. I know I certainly do. But if we may disagree on that, which of course we will continue to do so, we do have to also agree on the fact that this government's budget is set because of what happens in the UK Government. So if the UK Government, as they chose to do last year, with no notice and no consultation, want to take away over £150 million out of our budget in year, there is nothing we can do about that, Presiding Officer. I don't find that acceptable. It's disappointing.
Let's hear the Cabinet Secretary.
It's disappointing that opposition party members seem to think that's okay. I would have hoped that being able to protect our pensioners, or indeed protect the budget that comes to this Parliament, would be something that we could all agree on. And it's sad that Mr Hoy refuses to do so.
I call Emma Roddick, to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Freezing temperatures and significant snowfall in the last week left many households in the Highlands and Islands struggling to meet the cost of heating their homes after yet another energy price rise. Despite promising to slash energy bills, prices have instead skyrocketed under Labour. While the Scottish Government works to protect pensioners from the worst of Westminster austerity, the UK Government has failed to act, instead choosing to cut support. So does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the UK Government must follow the example of the SNP Government and take meaningful action to tackle rising bills?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Emma Roddick's quite right to point out that meaningful action is required. That's exactly what this government has delivered today. She's quite right to point out that the UK government should do likewise. It is not too late, Presiding Officer, for them to change their mind, to reflect on their poor decision and come back with a universal payment. That would be the right thing to do. We've already had a discussion and debate within this statement and the questions and answers about other aspects of meaningful action that the UK Government can undertake, whether it's about the social tariff, whether it's about protecting people from increases in energy costs. That's the action that the UK Government must take responsibility for. While they continue to ignore that, we'll get on with the action that we can take as announced today.
I call Rachel Hamilton.
Officer. Has the Cabinet Secretary any advice for constituents who have worked hard all their lives for pension entitlements but don't qualify for pension credits? I very much welcome the £100, but it won't go far enough to support and keep elderly and vulnerable people warm this winter.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would agree with Rachel Hamilton that there is a great deal that could be improved around pension credit. It's a shame that the Conservative Government didn't do so when they were in power. We are keen to ensure that older people and indeed other people can receive advice to assist them on their rights, and that's exactly why we make provision for welfare rights and citizens' advice bureaus funding, etc., to be able to provide that. But again, I say to Rachel Hamilton, she cannot come to this chamber, and again, unless I'm mistaken, she's again asking us to spend more money at the same time as we're going to hear next week, once again, that the same party want us to make tax cuts. You cannot have it both ways, Presiding Officer.